The great Kate Bush has been a unique and remarkable performer over the course of her now nearly 50-year career. She is a terrific singer, a great and accomplished songwriter, and throughout her career has also integrated elements of visuals and dance into her music. The manners in which she's presented her music to the public over the years has been nothing short of extraordinary. Kate Bush started her career rather early. She was something of a musical prodigy. She, by the age of 13, was accomplished on the piano and accomplished as a songwriter. At that age, she, with assistance from her family, developed dozens of songs that she committed to tape and used to market herself to record companies. Her early demo tapes found their way to David Gilmour, who would in turn introduce Kate to several of his associates at Abbey Road Studios, including the recording engineer Jeff Emmerich, the recording engineer and producer Alan Parsons, and through Parsons, his arranger and orchestrator Andrew Powell, with whom Kate Bush would work on her first two albums, 1978's The Kick Inside and 1979's Lionheart. The Kick Inside was released in 1978 when Kate Bush had not yet turned 20 years old. It reached number 1 on the English charts and has been cited as being the first album by a female artist in the UK to make number 1 where all of the songs on the album were authored by the artist herself. By comparison, Lionheart, the follow-up, was considered something of a disappointment. It reached number 6, not exactly a failure. Kate's third album, Never Forever, was a number 1 hit as well in 1980. This would be her first appearance on the American Billboard charts, though. In these early days, and indeed throughout Kate Bush's career, her accomplishments in the United States always lagged behind. She wasn't completely unknown, but she was probably better known for her collaborations with other artists in the early 1980s, most notably her collaborations with Peter Gabriel on his third album. She provides backing vocals in particular on the song Games Without Frontiers, and especially on Peter Gabriel's 1986 album, So, where she provides duet vocals with Gabriel on the wonderful song Don't Give Up. It's really only been in the last several years between Kate Bush's naming to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which is generally an American institution more so than a worldwide institution despite its name, and with the use of her music as part of the soundtrack for the hit cable TV show Stranger Things, where she's really gotten herself into the conscience of the American listening public. So the obvious question is, why? Why did it take so many years? Well, I'm going to do my best to answer that question with this episode. There's a short answer and a long answer, where there's at least 3 reasons, and I would posit that there's a possible 4th reason as to why Kate Bush really did not see her career blossom in the United States as it did in the UK and in Europe. The short answer to the question, though, is the name of her record company, EMI. I'm sure there are some of you who are watching who would argue that Kate Bush was lucky and possibly even privileged to secure a record company contract when she was only 16 years old. She was signed by EMI in 1974 with assistance, as I said, from David Gilmour, who at the time was, as a member of Pink Floyd, contracted to EMI Records worldwide, as well as given her association with Alan Parsons and Jeff Emmerich. Abbey Road Studios, where both Parsons and Emmerich worked, was, of course, owned by EMI Records. And certainly EMI Records treated Kate Bush very, very well in the formative years of her career in England and in the European market. However, EMI's American division, which for all intents and purposes meant their primary American label, Capitol Records, always had a somewhat difficult relationship with the artists that EMI would sign to its Columbia and Parlophone labels in the UK and across Europe. Certainly, you might remember that there was a band from Liverpool in 1963 that Parlophone signed, a band called the Beatles, that Capitol Records in the United States, at least initially, were not interested in distributing in the States. They didn't feel that the beat type of music that the Beatles personified was going to have a market in the US. Obviously, they were wrong, and they were able, despite their initial non-support of the band, to regain the rights for distribution of the Beatles' albums and go forward. One would think that having made that initial mistake on the Beatles, that Capitol would have been a bit more welcoming to the other artists that came out of that early 60s British invasion period. That wasn't really the case, however. There were only two other artists from that period that Capitol embraced to anywhere near the same degree as they did the Beatles. One band was Freddie and the Dreamers, who actually had their records distributed in the United States even before the Beatles' records were, in 1963. And they, once the Beatles emerged in the States in early 1964, were not exactly dismissed by Capitol Records, but certainly they were given second priority. Their records were shifted to a Capitol subsidiary label, Tower Records. Tower over time would come to be regarded as Capitol's teen label. It was the label for bands that were generally more regional in scope and was ultimately known as the label where garage bands that were only expected to perhaps produce one, maybe two hits, would be relegated. To underscore this point, there were quite a few bands that came through Abbey Road Studios in the early 60s that Capitol could have secured the services of, given that EMI had signed those acts and controlled the rights to those acts in the UK and in Europe. Several of Brian Epstein's other acts besides the Beatles, most notably Gerry and the Pacemakers and Cilla Black, had numerous top 10 hits in the UK, and in fact, Gerry and the Pacemakers had 4 top 10 hits in the United States, but not for Capitol. Capitol didn't pick him up. They didn't pick up Cilla Black either. Over the course of the 60s, that trend actually continued. The Hollies were signed to EMI's Columbia label in the UK. Capitol never picked them up. They ended up distributing their records in the United States with Imperial Records and then later CBS Epic. This trend continued into the psychedelic era. Perhaps most infamously, the band Pink Floyd signed with EMI Records to their Columbia label in Britain in 1967. Their first album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, was distributed by Capitol in the States, but not on the Capitol label proper. It was released on the Tower label, much to the chagrin and irritation of the band's producer, Norman Smith, and especially to Roger Waters, who viewed that their being relegated to a down-market subsidiary of EMI Capitol was something of an insult. As psychedelic music began to increase in popularity in Britain, Norman Smith would lobby with EMI to establish a label that focused on this new genre of music. And Norman Smith got the okay to establish Harvest Records. Pink Floyd would move to the Harvest label, Smith believing that doing so would give them more attention and would give them more respectability, particularly in the United States, who had agreed to pick up distribution of the Harvest label proper. And there were numerous other notable acts that signed with Harvest in this time, including Deep Purple, Barclay James Harvest, and The Move, the band that would ultimately, in the early 70s, morph into the Electric Light Orchestra. None of these bands, with the exception of Pink Floyd, would remain on the Harvest label in the United States. Deep Purple would sign with Tetragrammaton, a distributed label of Warner Brothers. The Move would first sign with A&M Records and later move on to United Artists. Capitol, perhaps obviously, did not have any real confidence that any of these bands could sell records in the United States. That would be proven wrong in March of 1973 by Pink Floyd with the release of their album, The Dark Side of the Moon. But by then, it was too late as far as Pink Floyd was concerned. We'll get back to that point in a few minutes. There was another issue as far as new artists signing on with the Capitol label in the United States. And this issue was true not only for English and European artists, but for new artists in general who played rock music. And that was that Capitol Records was never very keen in supporting new bands with promotional monies. Capitol had the interesting experience in the early 60s where not one, but 3 bands under their tutelage were able to sell significant numbers of records with very little in the way of promotion. The first of these was the original king of the surf guitar in the early 1960s, Dick Dale. Capitol obtained the rights to Dick Dale's music fairly early on, but after he had made his initial successes in the marketplace. Dale was therefore able to pretty much deal on his own terms when it came to marketing and promotion with the public, and Capitol needed to spend very, very little money in order for his continued success during the early 60s. The second of these bands was the Beach Boys, whom Capitol obtained the distribution rights for in 1962. The Beach Boys in this period would, if you'll excuse the pun, ride the crest of the wave of the surf genre for the next several years, and their music didn't really need significant promotion either at this point. Last but not least, the Beatles, of course, once they broke through in the United States in February of 1964, didn't really need any significant promotional push either. The executives at Capitol in this time frame had, for the most part, grown up with the label in the 1940s and early 1950s. Most of them did not have a great love of rock and roll as a genre in general. And so they were not keen to spend money to promote rock bands at all unless they felt that it was going to be bringing back significant dividends on the investment. In all fairness to the execs at Capitol, this was a view that was not unique to Capitol Records. Several of the other large labels at the time, including Columbia and RCA, had similar views about rock and roll. They didn't really spend money on the genre unless they felt that it would bring back tremendous dividends. But in Capitol's case, it was to the extreme insofar as that they had had such tremendous success with Dick Dale, the Beach Boys, and the Beatles, to where they just didn't feel that there was a need, that the music would sell itself if the music was good. Eventually, the word got out onto the street about Capitol's lack of interest in spending promotional dollars. And by the early 1970s, Capitol Records, at least within the musicians' communities in the larger American markets like New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, would be known by a rather derisive nickname. I think you could argue that the nickname was probably deserved. The third reason that held Kate Bush back in the American marketplace was that EMI Capitol Records didn't really know how to market her when her first album came out in 1978. In the late 1970s, starting around 1976, 1977 specifically, a wave of interest was emerging around rock music that was being created by strong female performers. 1976, in particular, was the year that the band Heart, featuring Ann and Nancy Wilson, emerged in the marketplace. Soon after, in 1977, Ellen Foley would emerge as initially Meat Loaf's foil on the song Paradise by the Dashboard Light, and soon after as an artist in her own right. By 1978, Pat Benatar would start making waves on the club scene in New York and soon would sign a record company contract with Chrysalis Records. Benatar was a hard rocker, but with an operatic voice, and she was very unique in her own right. One would have thought, with this interest in female-fronted rock and roll, that there would have been an almost instant place within the scene for Kate Bush. But the difference between Bush's music versus the music of the other three was that Kate Bush's music was not inherently loud rock and roll in the Led Zeppelin tradition of the time. Kate Bush's music was much more personal and thoughtful. It was probably more ephemeral in terms of its content. EMI wasn't quite sure how to position her music in the American marketplace, and as a result, they didn't try very hard, much to Kate Bush's chagrin, I'm sure. One irony around this was that these same artists generally respected Kate Bush's music tremendously. Pat Benatar went so far as to cover one of Kate Bush's first English hits, Wuthering Heights, on her multi-platinum album from 1980, Crimes of Passion. EMI would not give significant attention to marketing Kate Bush's music in the United States until the middle 1980s. By that time, the MTV Music Television channel was well established on American cable television. And by the mid-80s, EMI and their Capitol Records division, or in some cases the Harvest label of EMI, were, through the use of videos shown in regular rotation on MTV, reaping great dividends through the music of acts like, for example, Duran Duran and Thomas Dolby. So by the mid-80s, in particular by the time Kate Bush's great album Hounds of Love was cut, the label began funding videos for Kate Bush's music intended for MTV and for other video outlets. And she began, finally, getting some of the attention that she deserved in the United States. Which is not to say that EMI promoted her any more than they really had to. There is, here on YouTube, a rather infamous promotional interview that Kate Bush had done with the New York television personality Sue Simmons in support of the Hounds of Love album, and in particular, the single from that album, Running Up That Hill. I grew up in the New York area and knew the work of Sue Simmons very, very well. She was not the greatest interviewer, and certainly not someone that I would have expected to be assigned to interview a British recording artist. But Simmons' Kate Bush interview was amazingly bad. It was clear that EMI did not provide Sue Simmons with any significant promotional material or press package in order to familiarize her with who Kate Bush was, much less to be able to carry on an intelligent interview. Sue Simmons didn't even know the name of the single, Running Up That Hill. I think she called it Racing Up That Hill in the interview, and didn't even know the name of the Hounds of Love album. So Kate Bush was somewhat uncomfortable with the interview right from the beginning. As I said, Simmons wasn't the right person to conduct this interview, but those types of issues were not Simmons' fault. I put those squarely on the back of EMI and Capitol Records. Last but not least, while I don't have a way to prove this, I think there might have been a fourth consideration around why Kate Bush didn't receive a lot of support from EMI Capitol when her career first started. And that was regarding who brought her into the company and who her mentor was. That, of course, was David Gilmour. By the time Kate Bush was ready to begin work on her first album, The Kick Inside, Pink Floyd and David Gilmour had already separated from Capitol Records in the United States. Pink Floyd had a rather unique contract with EMI Records that allowed them, for a reduced royalty rate, to make use of unlimited studio time at Abbey Road. This was put to great use on their Dark Side of the Moon album, where they put in, with help from Alan Parsons, hours and hours of time to achieve a masterful result. And that showed in the performance of the album in the marketplace. Dark Side of the Moon still is one of the greatest selling rock albums of all time. However, that unique contract that Pink Floyd had with EMI ended following the Dark Side album. That was the last album that their initial contract with EMI governed. And when it came time to negotiate a new contract, Pink Floyd remained with EMI in the rest of the world, but in North America, changed labels to CBS Columbia. The band in general, and specifically Roger Waters in particular, had never really forgiven EMI Capitol regarding the treatment of the band over the course of those early years. They felt that they had been relegated to a corporate ghetto when their early albums came out on the Tower label. They felt that the treatment of the band, once they were moved to the Harvest label, was only slightly better. And in some regards, they wanted to make the statement following Dark Side of the Moon and that album's great success, that now that they've achieved success in spite of lack of support from EMI, that they were going to leverage that success by moving to another label and getting the very best deal they could. Indeed, once Pink Floyd moved to CBS Columbia in the States, they found out that Columbia would provide them significant paid promotion support for their albums going forward. Paid promotion for their albums and singles was apparently never even a subject for discussion with Pink Floyd and the contacts they had at EMI. One can only imagine around the lyrics of Pink Floyd's song Have a Cigar and the infamous lyric, "Oh, by the way, which one's pink?" who at EMI, and probably someone at Capitol Records, they might have been singing about. I have no doubt that as a result of Pink Floyd's so acrimoniously leaving EMI Capitol, that some of the resentment that Capitol had around that might very well have trickled downstream to impact Kate Bush's career, given the close relationship that she had with David Gilmour. Again, I suppose one could argue that in being offered a record company contract by what was then one of the biggest record companies in the world, in EMI, at the age of 16, is not something we should feel sorry for Kate Bush about. But at the same time, I can only guess what kind of success she might have achieved had her initial records been made with another label where these issues that I've just described hadn't come into play. I don't expect, of course, that I'll ever have the opportunity to do this, but the journalist in me would love to have a conversation with David Gilmour just once, where I could ask him the question around what impact, both positive and negative, he thinks his relationship with Kate Bush might have had on her early career. Certainly, there were positives. She was able to land the EMI contract in part because of that relationship. But whether there was animosity leveled at her from EMI in the United States as a result of that relationship, it'd be interesting to hear David's take on that as well. Anyway, that is the episode for this week. I hope you've enjoyed it, as always. If you have any questions or comments, of course, please feel free to post them. I'll do my best to answer promptly. If you like the episode, click like. If you're not a subscriber yet, please join us. Take good care. Bye-bye.